Today I want to give you one really good reason to believe that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth happened. Let's get into it. So, what is my one really good reason to believe the resurrection happened? It's the very fact that Christianity still exists today. And I know you might be thinking, how is that a good reason to believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave? I want to give you 3 facts that will hopefully help support this claim. The first fact is that political, social, and religious movements were common at the time of Jesus. And when their leaders were killed, the movements quickly dispersed and were never heard from again. And here are a few examples of this. Our first example is Judas of Galilee, who, alongside Zadok the Pharisee, started what is known as the Fourth Philosophy, or the Fourth Sect, which is more commonly referred to as the Zealots. They were Jewish nationalists who opposed giving taxes to Rome. After he was killed, the movement dissipated. Next is Theudas. He claimed to be a prophet who could divide the Jordan River. Josephus tells us that many were misled by him, and his movement was quickly quenched whenever the Romans had him beheaded. The next guy, I'm probably going to butcher his name. I'm going to pronounce it Athronges. Athronges led the Jews in a rebellion against Archelaus and the Romans that lasted about 2 years. He was eventually killed alongside his brothers, and just like the others, his movement was quenched. Next is Simon of Perea. He too led military conquests against the Romans. According to Josephus, he burned down the royal palace at Jericho, set fire to many other of the king's houses in several places in the country, utterly destroying them. But he was quickly overtaken by Herod's infantry and beheaded. There's also some speculation around Simon of Perea that he claimed to be the Messiah. And finally, in the 2nd century, we have Simon Bar Kokhba, who started what is known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 CE against the Roman Empire. He established a Jewish state for about 3 years before being killed by Roman troops, and many thought him to be the Messiah, including Rabbi Akiva, who was a prominent Jewish rabbi at the time. And after Bar Kokhba was killed, just like the others, his movement was quenched when the Romans really cracked down on the Jewish people. N.T. Wright adds, in the 1st century and the roughly 50 years around either side of it, we know of 10 or a dozen other Jewish messianic or quasi-messianic movements, and we know those movements came to an end with the violent death of the founder or the key figure. And when that happened, if you were a follower of that movement, you had a choice: either give up the movement or find a new Messiah. Fascinatingly, the Jewish groups that followed Jesus of Nazareth didn't do either of those things. They continued the movement, and they said, astonishingly, that the recently crucified Jesus was the Messiah. And interestingly enough, if you read the Gospels, you'll see that the Jesus movement was going to suffer a similar fate. In Luke 24, Jesus is speaking to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. And he said, "What are these words you're exchanging with one another as you're walking?" And they came to a stop, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you possibly the only one living near Jerusalem who does not know about the things that happened in these days?" And he said to them, "What sort of things?" And they said to him, "Those about Jesus the Nazarene, who proved to be a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people. And how the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since all these things happened." So, we have all these messianic or quasi-messianic movements that came to an end with the death of their leader. And it appears the Jesus movement was going to suffer a similar fate. But what changed? If you were to ask the followers of Jesus, they would have all given you the same answer, that he rose from the dead. This brings us to our second fact, which is the 1st century conception of resurrection for the Jewish people. The Jews believed that there would be one bodily resurrection at the end of the world. To summarize their view, they believed that when you died, you remained in the grave until the end of the world, where your soul would return to your body and you would have a new bodily life. This helps us understand Martha's response to Jesus in John chapter 11. If you don't remember, Lazarus, her brother, had been dead for 4 days. In verse 23 and 24, we get this exchange. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise from the dead." And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. It's also important to mention that there were a lot of questions and debates around this doctrine around the first century. People were asking if you were going to be married in heaven, if your new body was going to be corruptible or incorruptible, and things like this. And it was also a tertiary doctrine, meaning that it wasn't a very important one. The Jewish people's main doctrine and focus was that God had revealed the Torah to them, and they were supposed to be a light to the world because of this revelation that they had received. So, how did the topic of resurrection go from a tertiary doctrine before the time of Christ to the very center of Christian theology in as little as 20 years after Christ in Paul's letters? Every early Christian document, creed, and church father centered their teaching around bodily resurrection. This sudden shift in focus demands an explanation, and here's my contention. I contend that in order to explain this sudden change in the minds of this early Christian movement on the topic of resurrection, without appealing to the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, you will have to contrive a narrative that neglects some of the data we have, or you'll posit some data which we have no evidence for, or you'll tell a self-contradictory story while trying to be consistent with the data. This contention does contain an implicit assertion that the resurrection hypothesis is the most parsimonious with the data that we have, and is the least ad hoc of our options. Our third and final fact that makes it utterly surprising that Christianity still exists today is the fact that Christians were horribly tortured and even killed for the claim that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. I actually have an entire series on early Christian persecution and why I think it happened, and there's good evidence for it. You can click on the card above to get a fuller and deeper dive into that topic. For this video, I simply want to point out that people will not suffer and die for views that they know are false. The earliest apostles would know whether or not they were lying about the resurrection, and the fact that there is no evidence of any kind that the apostles ever recanted, and we know that early Christians were persecuted and killed for their beliefs. This gives us incredibly strong reasons to believe that Christianity is in fact true. It also goes a long way in explaining why Christianity still exists today. The earliest followers watched their leaders, the founders of the movement, go to their graves, proclaiming this message to be true, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, which gave them the courage to carry on their legacy in the face of the persecution that they too would face. And that's going to sum up my case for why I believe the very existence of Christianity today serves as good evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The movement didn't immediately dissolve after Christ died, but the apostles kept going, declaring their recently crucified leader to be the long-awaited Messiah. The massive shift in the focus on resurrection in the first century after Christ cries out for an explanation that is parsimonious with all the data we have, as well as not being ad hoc. And finally, the absolutely admirable courage of the apostles and their immediate followers in the face of terrible persecution, such as being burned alive, crucified, or tied up and mauled by dogs, speaks to their unshakable conviction that what they claimed about the resurrection was true and not a mythologized legend that they had conjured up in their collective imaginations. Thank you so much for watching this video. That was one really good reason to believe that the bodily resurrection of Jesus really happened. Give it a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you're new and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.